Transmission. It all started when the potavirus hit the iceberg lettuce crop in Salinas that winter. At first, it wasn't a big deal, just the seeds produced by a corrupted mother plant germinating into infected seedlings, easily controlled. Then suddenly, it was more than a few plants, and then the leaf curl and vein discoloration started showing up in the hardy populations of wild prickly lettuce and yellow oxtongue. Then it jumped to the spinach and beet crops, which finally got the university's ag department involved. No one had seen mosaic disease rip through an area so quickly or thoroughly before, as biblical as a flood. The scientists said, virus mutation, dump the whole crop, ending the late growing season that year and maybe all the next. The migrant workers, as efficient as French revolutionaries, severed every head before moving to a distant fertile land, leaving the farmers to grieve their plants like children. The heads, all 27,300 tons of them, ended up in isolation at the far edge of the landfill, past the little knuckle of natural hills where you could stand and gaze out over the garbage below, sun-grayed and wind-rippled like the ocean's surface during a storm. The lettuce deposited on top formed a pale green flow, about 5 feet high and crenellated along its edges, a football field or two of compressed decay. An iceberg of iceberg heads, and as abnormally cold weather froze the rotting leaves, as slick and slippery as its Antarctic doppelganger. Nobody was allowed out on the lettuce to prevent possible transmission by shoe from dump site to farm soil, so of course it became a midnight gathering spot for teens, which is how the body was found. As the night's on-call detective, Lieutenant Susan Simpson was called to the scene not long after its discoverer had been taken, drunk and screaming, by her friends back to town. A few uniformed officers went slip-sliding around the edge of the taped-off area, uncertain and ungainly. The murder rate here as low as a beat cop's ice skating skill. As the green-black of rotting lettuce sludged over the tops of the lieutenant's shoes and settled like seaweed flecks around her ankles, her main concern approaching the group, as a cop and a woman, was not landing on her ass in front of those of lower rank. "Waiter, there's a fly in my salad," she said, nodding towards the corpse. "Who's got a shovel? Or some tongs?" The men grumbled a grudging chuckle and stomped their feet. The youngest recruit headed back across the ice to the patrol cars, loping away like a college kid abandoning his dirty laundry at mom's house. He was happy to be away from the dead body, even if it meant a slippery hike, because your first cadaver is a horrible sight. This one was submerged as much as buried, and seemed to be struggling towards both light and air, its purple face tilted upwards, mouth agape, among the vegetable heads. Definitely a homicide. Young face, or the frigid lettuce muck facial has relieved it of its wrinkles post-mortem. And a woman, because who would slog out here dragging a full-grown man? "And evidence bags," the lieutenant yelled at the retreating officer and turned back to the rest. "Any local reports of missing persons in the last week? In Northern California? West Coast?" They shrugged a group no, their minds contemplating the task of digging a body out of what was essentially an infinite number of disintegrating but still round bowling balls, instead of the possible identity of the victim. "We're going to need a backhoe, aren't we?" the lieutenant said. "Maybe a skid steer, too." Birthing a boy baby 20 years ago introduced her to the vocabulary of bulldozers and excavators. A detective has to draw on the whole world of her experience to solve a case. More cops made their way back across the lettuce flow, grateful for the warm and seated task of rousing a couple of equipment operators out of their beds. Then it was just the lieutenant and Officer Daniels left out in the cold with a cadaver. She sat down on her canvas messenger bag and started rolling heads of lettuce his way. "Look for evidence," she said, and he sighed and settled onto his knees and heels. When the lieutenant freed the victim's head for a moment, she saw that it is indeed a young female. She retrieved a cheap silver-plated cross from around the purple neck. Either a runaway or a druggie, sweet-faced, despite the rictus of death. And somebody's baby. Officer Daniels played lettuce head soccer in the muck. Even though the lieutenant had actually met the victim, just days earlier been introduced to her standing in her own kitchen, she failed to recognize her. Or she refused to recognize her without the ham sandwich in her hand that the lieutenant's son had rustled out for the lost girl. The lieutenant herself had poured her a glass of milk, handed it to her at the family's reclaimed barnwood table 19 years into her career with the police. But there's a sixth sense in most police, a defensively developed, hyper-noticing sense. And so, she saw it, even while her mind willed her not to. There, in the victim's fist near the surface, the glint of something gold. The detective felt her heart hurtle against her breastbone and her skull compress her brain. Even covered by the girl's closed fingers and the wavering light of a cloud-obscured moon, she recognized that metal, its shape and gleam. For the detective, at this point, everything slowed. She saw Daniels lose his footing on the ice-slick surface and crash to the ground like a cartoon character, his feet spinning like saw blades. She saw the young officer muscling a couple of shovels across the lettuce field, bashing his shins with every step. The moon winked. She saw her son's toddler face wearing shampoo, whiskers, and beard. She saw him batting Little League. She saw him cutting thick slabs of ham for a second sandwich for the girl, the knife expert in his hands. Her fingers pried open the bone cage of the dead girl's fingers, removed her son's gold lighter, and slid it into her pocket. The wind kicked up. The tang of vegetal rot mixed with the sickly sweetness of animal decay.